Welcome, everyone. This event will go ahead and get started because it is 1 p.m. Welcome to Law Enforcement and Genetic Data. This is the second in a series of 4 online discussions for journalists this fall, produced by the Hastings Center in partnership with the Center for ELSI Resources and Analysis, CERA, a federally funded project that builds the community of researchers focused on the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics and genomics. We are pleased to be joined by Sarah Zhang, a staff writer for The Atlantic, Cece Moore, a genetic genealogist, and Ellen Wright-Clayton, a professor at Vanderbilt University's Medical and Law School, who is a leader in the field of law and genomics and a Hastings Center Fellow. We hope for strong participation from the journalists, journalism students, and journalism educators in the audience. Please type questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can also use the chat function to share relevant resources. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Hastings Center's website later today. It will also be available on the CERA's website, ELSI Hub. Now, I would like to introduce Mildred Solomon, president of the Hastings Center, who will say more about the annual journalism discussion series.
Thank you, Ashna, and welcome to all of you, our guests. This event is the second in a series of events which the Hastings Center has launched this year and will continue to offer going forward on an annual basis. We're calling it Bioethics for Journalists. The series is a set of discussions to help journalists identify ethics questions and to pursue investigation of those questions on a wide range of emerging topics in health and science. The series is part of the Hastings Center's Callahan Public Programs, which is named for our co-founder, philosopher Daniel Callahan. The Callahan Public Programs is an initiative that's been established and supported by the Andrew and Julie Klingenstein Family Foundation and the John and Patricia Klingenstein Fund in honor of Dan and his commitments to public engagement. I'd like to express deep appreciation to the Klingenstein family for their vision and for their support. The theme for this year's series is Genomics in Society, New Developments, New Questions. And we're undertaking this year's events in collaboration with the Center for ELSI Research and Analysis, which is a project led at Columbia University by Dr. Sandra Sujin Lee, who heads the Division of Ethics in the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics at Columbia. Many thanks to Columbia and to her, Dr. Sujin Lee, for this partnership. The Hastings Center is a bioethics research institute that produces scholarly analysis and policy recommendations on a wide range of ethical questions in health, healthcare, and the life sciences. In addition to our research, we have a co-equal commitment to public engagement. We believe that in a democracy, educated citizens should participate in decisions raised by advances in biomedical innovation, health, and science policy. And journalists are absolutely essential to that kind of public engagement. Yet, as a profession, you are under increasing assault. Business models for journalism have changed, creating major challenges. And now the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation has made it extremely difficult to figure out how to help people distinguish truth from illusion. We've launched this series to support you in the difficult but important work that you do. Today's event is on the use of genetic data by law enforcement to identify criminal suspects, data that comes from many sources, including a great deal from direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies and ancestry sites. To help us grapple with these issues, we are lucky enough to have a very distinguished moderator, Sarah Zhang. She's an award-winning staff writer for The Atlantic, and she's covered a number of critical issues in science and health. Sarah, we feel very fortunate to have your steady hand as moderator for what promises to be a really great session. So I'll turn it over to you right now.
Oh, thank you, Millie, for that really kind introduction. Thank you to our panelists for being here today, and thank you to everyone who's also tuning in today. As Ashna said at the beginning of the panel, we will be having some time for audience Q&As. So do be thinking about what you would like to ask our panelists, and you can type them into the Q&A box as they occur to you. So, as I was preparing for this panel, I was thinking that this is a really great time to be having a conversation about law enforcement and genetic data, because both elements of this, both the DNA and the law enforcement, have kind of been at the center of a lot of conversations about how we talk about it in society, but also how we as journalists should be covering it. So on the DNA side, obviously, we're getting to the point where DNA is just mainstream in a way it never was, 10 years ago. It used to be if you wanted to know about your DNA, you had to be part of a fancy lab. Now you can go get an ancestry DNA or 23andMe test. You can talk about Christmas with your mom. It's just we're having a lot more conversations about how we think about how do we interpret our DNA, and also what expectations of privacy that we have. And on the other side, on law enforcement, I think there has been a real conversation within journalism about how to cover crime, how to cover race in the aftermath of George Floyd's death and the protests last year. I think that really also sparked a lot of conversations about how to think about law enforcement as sources. In a daily newspaper, when you're kind of reporting just what happened every day, there's sometimes a tendency to take the police report as the default for what happened, or the official record for what happened. And as we saw in the case of George Floyd's death, the initial police statement, it was man dies after medical incident during police interaction, which is massively understates what actually happened, to say the very least. And so, as we're having this conversation, I think we do want to keep in mind that DNA in law enforcement is not entirely new, but it goes back to at least the 1990s. In the mid-1990s is when the Department of Justice and the FBI set up a database called CODIS, which stands for the Combined DNA Index System. And this is made up of today of millions of profiles, mostly of people who have been arrested or convicted of a crime or crime scene DNA. And so if you've seen CSI, if you've heard about a rape kit being processed, for the most part, they're probably searching for hits or matches in CODIS. Since then, there have also been state and local jurisdictions that have set up kind of their own DNA databases. They've sometimes been called shadow DNA databases just because there isn't always that much oversight over whose DNA can go into them. So for example, there have been cases where people have been stopped for traffic violations, or stopped just because there was a suspect nearby and the police were kind of just taking swabs of everyone. And then that swab of this momentary interaction then goes into a DNA database where it might be kept forever. So I'm going to get a little bit technical here, just because I think it's important to understand why CODIS and sort of why everything that came before the Golden State Killer, a case that you're probably familiar with at this point, why that's actually a little bit different from what then happened in that case. So in CODIS, you're not storing anyone's entire genome. All that's being stored is actually just 20 markers called STRs. And what you have to know is that STRs tend to be really, really variable from person to person. They differ a lot from person to person. So you can, in most simple cases, pretty reliably tell whether, for example, a blood spot belonged to one person or not. But the reason STRs were chosen is that they actually don't tell you very much anything about anything else. They don't really give you any health information. They can't tell you what genetic risk diseases that you're predisposed to. And they can't tell you, what color is your skin, or what you look like, what color are your eyes. For that, you actually have to use a technology called genotyping, which instead of looking at 20 markers, you're actually looking at something like maybe 700,000 markers across the genome, and looking at what letter is at that particular spot. So if you have taken an ancestry DNA test or a 23andMe test, this is what happened. And as you know, these are also way more powerful. This can tell you a lot about your genetic ancestry. It can tell you about whether you're predisposed to cancer, breast cancer or colon cancer. It can tell you maybe your eye color and your hair color. And so the Golden State Killer case, where the police first made use of this technology, they used DNA profiles from companies like Ancestry and 23andMe. Those cases did not directly involve those companies. In that case, it users who had voluntarily kind of downloaded their own profiles and uploaded to genealogy sites. And before we knew that this could be used for crime, these genealogy sites were routinely used by people who are just simply trying to build out their own family trees. Or sometimes it was adoptees who were looking for birth parents, or it was the children of sperm donors who were looking for their biological fathers. But then in April 2018, the Golden State Killer was arrested, and it became just really clear how powerful this technique was, and also how much more information this puts in the hands of law enforcement. So in the immediate months after the Golden State Killer, as police started using this technique, you saw dozens of cold cases that were just suddenly solved. And then also a lot of questions about privacy were raised, of course. So, on one hand, these databases were originally created for genealogy. There's a lot of personal information. At the time, at least, people didn't know how that their information could be accessed by law enforcement. On the other hand, anyone can sign up for these sites. So why should we say that law enforcement can do something that you and I can do? But if we're going to allow a law enforcement to do that, how do we then also safeguard the privacy of the people whose DNA are in these databases? And actually not just the people whose DNA are directly in those databases, but people who are related to them. Because, if my sister, for example, decided to upload her DNA, that can implicate me, even if I didn't want her to or didn't even know about it. So I think these are some of the questions I hope we can tackle over the next hour or so. I'm really excited to look and really looking forward to this conversation because our panelists both know a lot about this topic, but come from really different backgrounds. So Cece Moore is the Chief Genetic Genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, where she heads the genetic genealogy services for law enforcement. She's worked on dozens, if not hundreds, of cases with law enforcement at this point. And Ellen Wright Clayton is a bioethicist and law professor at Vanderbilt who's been writing about genetics and the law in all sorts of contexts and not just crime. So with that, I will hand it over to our panelists for some introductory remarks, and we'll start with Cece.
Hello, how are you? Glad to be here today. Get this started. I wanted to talk a little bit about investigative genetic genealogy in practice. And first of all, I wanted to talk about the terms that we use for this new field. There's a lot of different terms that are being used out there by law enforcement and by the media. And I really prefer this term investigative genetic genealogy. I think it's maybe the second most popular one. The first is probably forensic genetic genealogy. But investigative genetic genealogy really sets apart what we're doing. There has been forensic genealogists in the field of genealogy for many, many years. And what they do is very different than the work that we're doing with law enforcement today. And so in order to delineate between those two different fields within professional genealogy, I strongly advocate for the use of investigative genetic genealogy because it's very unique and different from the others. Some people are using the term long-range familial search, which is problematic because what we're doing is not technically familial search. That's done within the law enforcement databases that Sarah just talked about that use the STRs. So the CODIS database, we are using a totally different type of genetic marker and technique. And so by using familial search, it's really confusing between those two different types of genetic database searches. Also, familial searches are on compelled DNA, people that were compelled to provide that, and genetic genealogy is on voluntarily submitted DNA. And so I strongly request that we start using the investigative genetic genealogy term whenever possible. So what databases are we using for this? Well, primarily we're using GEDmatch, which is a third-party raw data repository, meaning they are not taking DNA tests. You're not sending saliva into them or swabs. They are accepting raw data uploads from people that have tested at other consumer DNA testing companies. They have about 1.5 million genetic profiles now. As of May 19th, 2019, if you want to be part of the law enforcement matching pool, you have to actively opt in. And so about 500,000 people have done this. So for violent criminal identifications, we only have access to about a third of that database. However, in January of this year, they changed their policy. So if we are working on an unidentified decedent, trying to identify someone who's passed, a Jane or John Doe, we have access to compare against the whole database, which is about 1.5 million, as I said. We are also using family tree DNA as our secondary database. It has about 1.25 million genetic profiles. And there you have to actively opt out if you don't want to be part of the law enforcement matching pool. And so only a very small number of people have done that. So we have access to most of that database. As Sarah mentioned, these profiles contain about 700,000 SNPs or genetic markers. Now, the largest databases are Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, and MyHeritage DNA. Ancestry probably has 15 million people in their genetic database now. 23andMe, over 12 million, and MyHeritage DNA, about 5 million. But we can't access these for law enforcement matching. This is a big misconception that's out there, and I really would love it if the media would become educated on this particular aspect. Very many articles will say that Ancestry DNA was used or 23andMe was used, and that's just not the case. We do not have access to them. Their terms of service bar law enforcement's use. 23andMe and Ancestry DNA don't accept uploads, which means that you can't just upload a file into their databases for comparison. MyHeritage DNA does accept uploads, but they are barring law enforcement uploads. We can't use the CODIS database. It has about 20 million profiles in it, but it's a different type of genetic marker, as Sarah explained. And so we can't use that for genetic genealogy. So once we've uploaded into these databases, it's not an automatic solve, as some people think. There's a lot of work and a lot of considerations. And you have to remember that only the most dedicated genealogists have uploaded to GEDmatch. It's a much smaller database. A lot of people didn't know about it, now more do. But it's a small percentage of the people that have tested. And this is usually because they're highly motivated to solve a significant family mystery. They might be adopted. They might have misattributed paternities. Maybe they took a consumer DNA test and found out their father wasn't their biological father. They might be donor conceived, or they might have significant genealogical brick walls. And so if they don't know their biological family tree, and if their paper trail, their documentary trail, is not representative of their true genetic inheritance, that of course can impact our being able to use them to identify the person we're working to identify. The other consideration is that genetic genealogy databases have what I call a reverse bias. In law enforcement databases, as you may know, it tends to be heavily weighted toward minorities type of DNA. In law enforcement, genetic genealogy databases, we are working with people who mostly have primarily Northwestern European DNA, ancestry, And so that's not to say there aren't African Americans, people of Latin American ancestry, or recent immigrant ancestry in these databases, but there are far fewer. And so we're much more likely to be able to identify someone of primarily Northwestern European ancestry and someone who has deep roots in the United States. There's a lot of misconceptions out there that I'm always trying to dispel. One is that we have access to the match's raw genetic data or DNA code. We don't. We are not able to access that. What we get is a list of people who share what we consider significant amounts of DNA with the person we're trying to identify. That might be less than 1% of their DNA, and it often is. And so we just know how much DNA is shared between these two people and the locations on the chromosomes. I also don't have access to any sort of enhanced information on these matches. I only have access to what anyone would have. Most people only have their name and email address. A lot of people use aliases. And I don't have access to learning anything more about them any more than the public does. And at this point, if I'm working with law enforcement, I actually have less access because of the opt-in requirements at GEDmatch. As I mentioned, we do not have access to the largest consumer DNA testing databases for investigative genetic genealogy. If I'm working on an adoption case, I can compare against about 35 million individuals, but for law enforcement, it's a much smaller number. maybe about 1 million, maybe 1.5 million or so. There's some overlap between the GEDmatch and family tree DNA databases. Very often I get asked, what's the one match that solved a case? And this should never be the case. It should never be one match that identifies or helps to identify one of these individuals. It should always be a network or a web of matches that are all helping you reach the same conclusion or pointing in the same direction. So even if we get a very close family match, it needs to be vetted because somebody's family tree on paper may not reflect their true genetic origins. So this is an instance where skill level and experience is really important in doing this work. Another is that investigative genetic genealogy techniques are new, which is not true. They may be new for law enforcement applications, but I started developing these exact same techniques over a decade ago for people of unknown parentage. So these are already tried and true. We have helped hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people reunite with newly found biological family. And so we've known the power of genetic genealogy for a long time. And for those who think that this is a new thing, Pandora has been out of the box for some time. It was just not something most people were paying attention to until law enforcement started using it. One of the most important misconceptions is that people believe most of the research that I'm doing is using genetic information, but it's actually public records. I don't spend much time analyzing the DNA. I really just need to know if two people share DNA, how much, and then I use that amount to predict how closely or distantly related they are. And then I'm immediately turning to the public records and building trees. Building trees is what I'm doing all day, every day. I'm using public resources like FamilySearch.org, newspapers.com, Genealogy Bank, which is also a newspaper archive and obituary archive, Been Verified, which is a people search database, Google, I might go 20 pages back in Google looking for information, and places like White Pages Premium. And so once I know how much DNA is shared, the rest of the time I am trying to find information about this individual's family. It's somewhat rare that they have uploaded their family tree to these sites. So I have to determine who is the contributor of that DNA, who are their parents, who are their grandparents, and so on. And to do that, I'm using public record resources. And let's talk about social media. I am spending a lot of time on Facebook, learning about people's families, family structures, etc. And so if people are concerned about genetic privacy, my point is really they should be equally or more concerned about what's being put out there on social media about them and their family members. Your DNA means absolutely nothing to me if I can't figure out how to build your family tree, who you're related to, and then what that family structure is. Another misconception is that genetic genealogy can lead to an arrest. Well, it can't directly lead to an arrest because what we provide is really just a tip. It's a highly scientific tip. It's a lead generator, but law enforcement has to do their due diligence and do their full investigation, like they would if I called in a name to Crime Stoppers. They should never arrest someone. They hopefully never will arrest someone based on genetic genealogy. They have to get that match to their traditional forensic profile, that CODIS profile, before they arrest anybody. There's a lot of focus on the arrests, but genetic genealogy's real power is to eliminate the vast majority of the population from ever being under consideration. Even if we haven't been able to narrow it down to one person or one immediate family, we can still help to eliminate the vast majority of the population from even being a person of interest. And the more matches we have and the more data we have, the more we can narrow it down. So this chart here, I don't have time to go through it, but this is an example of building family trees for 13 matches, identifying common ancestors, which you see common ancestors, which you see up in the colors above, and building forward family. And so there's a misconception that if you limit data we have for investigating knowledge, how less, it's absolutely the opposite. The more data, the more matches we have, the more we can narrow it down to just one family or one individual. And the higher the skill level is of the genetic genealogist, the less number of people that will ever be looked at in an investigation through the genetic genealogy methods. So in this case, we had 4 genetic networks of common ancestors that tie together eventually through one marriage. And this ties all 13 matches to one immediate family and narrows the focus eventually to just 2 brothers. This is a case where they had interviewed thousands of people, DNA tested hundreds of men, and all of those people ended up being innocent because the one person it ended up being, John D. Miller, was not even on their radar. He didn't appear in their file. Investigative genetic genealogy is we can eliminate the need to interview hundreds of or thousands of persons of interest. We can keep the focus off the innocent from the very beginning, hopefully help lower or eliminate the number of people that are being wrongly convicted if they never get pulled into the investigation in the first place. We can conserve and focus agency and public resources for more efficient investigations, save public funds. Obviously, we can make society a safer place by helping to identify these violent criminals and get them off the streets. And we can provide answers to victims and their families. My team alone has had positive identifications in over 180 cases now. We're averaging just a little over 1 per week since we started doing this service for law enforcement 3.5 years ago. Most of these are violent criminals, although we also work with unidentified decedents. So some of our cases have been that as well. I don't call them solves because we're really not solving the case. We are helping to identify the DNA contributor. In some of these cases, we were successful in doing that, but that person was ruled out through further investigation as having anything to do with the crime. So just because their DNA was there and identified, it didn't rush law enforcement to arresting that person, and further investigation explained why that DNA was there and they were not believed to be the perpetrator. Have any of these cases gone to trial? Yes, 12 cases have gone to jury trials where the perpetrator or the suspect was identified through investigative genetic genealogy. 10 of those were Parabon cases, my team's cases, and 2 were cases worked by other genetic genealogy providers. All have resulted in conviction by jury. So the juries have been accepting this, understanding it. However, it really hasn't been a big part of the trials because the precedent so far that's being set is that genetic genealogy is really not relevant. It's not evidence that needs to be presented in court. It was just a lead. And what they present in court is that DNA match they get to that traditional forensic STR profile. There are many more cases that have resulted in guilty plea convictions, and there are many cases that are working their way through the courts that have been delayed because of COVID and a lot of the courts being shut down. So many are working their ways through the courts still. So there is a real immense power behind genetic genealogy. It can really help us to identify these violent criminals and to provide names to the deceased individuals that have been waiting for years and decades in some cases. But with this immense power comes responsibility. We have to treat this tool in responsible ways and ethical ways. If we do not follow best practices, it could slip out of our hands and we could lose this tool. We could lose public trust. And so it's so important that we use this tool ethically. We follow the rules, we follow the company terms of service. We are very careful with the identities of the matches and protect those. And we make sure that we are handling this very powerful tool with responsibility. What's the future? I think it's very bright as long as we treat this tool with responsibility and ethics, as I mentioned. And I hope we will be able to use it to eventually identify tens of thousands of violent criminals and resolve these cases. This is my contact information. If you're interested in reaching out, please feel free. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Cece, for such an informative presentation, kind of close to the ground, telling us exactly how this works. Next, we'll have Ellen, whenever you're ready.
Uh-oh, why am I frozen? So, wow. Okay, here we go. Thank you so much for inviting me to come here today. And I'm going to follow up on Cece's incredibly helpful talk to raise some of the ethical and legal issues that have been raised by this technology. Okay. The big question is to what extent and under what conditions should law enforcement be able to access genetic information that was collected for other purposes? The focus today is on direct-to-consumer genetic testing, but the fact of the matter is there are other sources of identified genetic information, most notably the electronic medical record. And it should be noted that the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act allows access. This sort of data, however, is more useful for confirmation than it is for the genetic genealogy that Cece has so clearly discussed. So what is the added value of this direct-to-consumer data for law enforcement? We know that more than 20 million DNA profiles of people who have been arrested or convicted of crime, either in CODIS or in state or local repositories. But as we know, or would suspect, these profiles are primarily come from minorities, because that's who gets arrested or convicted in this country by and large. And a recent law review article in California Law Review actually goes through some of the data that shows who is included in those databases. And as we've already heard, and I'll make a few more points about this, more than 40 million people have pursued direct-to-consumer genetic testing. And many of them have posted their personal results on the internet, which some project will make it possible for most people of Northern European ancestry to be identified. This is a citation to an article by Yaniv Ehrlich and his group that makes this claim. But one of the things that I want to make here and emphasize here is that something that Sarah pointed out, which is that it's not just the DNA of the person who posted their DNA up there, but it's also their relatives. I've never posted my DNA to the web that I know of, but certainly my sisters could, my cousins, many other people in my family, all of those would implicate me. And so that is the reason why these data, because they primarily come from people of Northern European ancestry, are potentially could identify most people of that ancestry. The public is deeply conflicted about this use of data by law enforcement. This is an article from the Duke Law Journal that came out this year, where they surveyed 323 respondents about how intrusive they thought that that law enforcement use of direct-to-consumer genetic testing results would be. And about 70% of them said that it would be that it would violate their expectations of privacy. There were actually a number of questions, and it was all on a continuum, but nonetheless, the majority of them thought that law enforcement using DNA data was problematic. Another study, people were more willing to permit access to DNA data to solve crimes than to prevent crimes, another issue that people think about. Another study that I would alert you to is one that appeared in Public Health Genomics just recently, where they interviewed a number of people who had had direct-to-consumer genetic testing, and they too were somewhat concerned about the invasions of privacy, and particularly concerned about law enforcement. This graph to my right, which I guess is to your left, is an interview study that was done a number of years ago by McGuire et al., where they asked people about whether law enforcement should be allowed to search genealogic databases to create fake profiles, which was a strategy that was used in identifying the Golden State Killer, and about whether these companies should release their information about their customers. Generally, for nonviolent, they were less enthusiastic about nonviolent crime than they were about identifying perpetrators of violent crime, or children, or missing individuals. But nonetheless, the picture that I want to give you here from the published data is that people are of mixed minds about this. They are really not at all clear. And then finally, I want to talk about some focus groups that we did in our group regarding ancestry testing, where we actually asked a number of questions about what they thought about family finding, all the other reasons that people actually primarily use ancestry testing. And what we have found is that use by law enforcement was by far the most polarizing topic we discussed. People in general thought that finding relatives was a pretty good thing, but the idea about law enforcement and what would happen was something that they were really quite troubled about. Some endorsed the importance of finding criminals and thought that this was unequivocally great. Others cited Big Brother, and they did that in the most literal terms, that they really were concerned that this would lead to the surveillance state, that in a way that they didn't like. They also varied in whether they thought it would be all right if one of their relatives were identified as a suspect in this way. One respondent said, you know, we all have that uncle who we think is kind of shady, so if they found him, it'd probably be okay. Where others said, you know, you have to protect your tribe. And so the one question that we didn't ask, that I wish we had asked, is what they would think if they were detected as somebody who were possibly involved in criminal activity because one of their relatives, a sibling, a cousin, an aunt, an uncle had posted their DNA, and that was the tip. As Cece said, it's never enough. You always have to do further police work that led them that way. So this is so the point that I want to emphasize is that this is something that people are worried about. I'm hopeful these results will be published soon, but I was hoping to say so today, but I didn't get the news in time. So I want to talk a little bit about the evolving landscape. As Cece has pointed out, Ancestry and 23andMe vow to resist access by law enforcement. Some prosecutors have sought warrants, and some judges, a few judges, have actually even issued warrants. This is a big deal because Ancestry and 23andMe have been very vigorous in opposing all of this. Other sites such as GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA have varied in their policies. And I want to say how that has looked from my perspective, because Cece really laid this out appropriately, very well. GEDmatch, when the identification of the Golden State Killer happened, they got a ton of heat. This was a database that was simply set up to facilitate family finding and ancestry. And so they varied a lot in their immediate policy about whether to permit use by law enforcement. And as you see, they have had an opt-in policy. Family Tree DNA, interestingly, decided to take a different tack. For a while, they actually said, come and get testing at Family Tree DNA, because your DNA will be used to help law enforcement. Now, as she says, they have an opt-out policy, but they are not using that as their primary advertising tool. So it really shows what a volatile space this is. The US Department of Justice has issued guidance and in 2019 limiting the use to certain cases, usually involving very serious crime. Again, responding to public concern about how these data were going to be used. And you should know that this year, 2 states, Maryland and Montana, have passed laws that require a court permission before direct-to-consumer genetic testing results can be used for genetic genealogy. And so other states are considering similar statutes, one of which is California. So which is of course 10% of the nation. So you're here seeing that the states are beginning to listen to what their citizens are saying, and answering the question that we value privacy more than we value finding criminal suspects in some cases. I and my colleagues raised a fairly provocative suggestion a number of years ago, suggesting that what we needed was a universal genetic forensic database. Sorry, that's the title, so I can't get rid of it, Cece. But our proposal there was, might it be a desirable thing for people to be able to do direct-to-consumer genetic testing, which they do primarily for ancestry testing and primarily for family finding, to a much lesser degree for health finding, and allow them to make those kinds of connections if they want them for that purpose, and that instead, for the purposes of law enforcement, that what we may need instead is just a separate database that is just limited to use access by law enforcement. Now, why could that be a good thing? On the one hand, this is big, some would say this is Big Brother. On the other hand, it avoids the bias that currently exists in CODIS. It also would make sure that everybody is involved. And if everybody really were included, like lawmakers and like their families, maybe the lawmakers would then really put protections in place to make sure that other people couldn't get access to this database, and that really would truly be limited to law enforcement, as CODIS is. So I think there are a number of questions out there that we need to be thinking about. So I want to say just a word about my acknowledgements. First of all, my collaborators on this, James Hazel, who is a postdoc in our lab, who is currently now working on DNA access work in the Netherlands. Chris Lebogan, who is a Fourth Amendment scholar and who has been in this space for a long time. Brad Mallon, who is a privacy expert, and then our big projects in genetic privacy and identity in community settings. Because frankly, when you look at what people think about when they think about genetic privacy, one of the things they think about and that makes them anxious is access to genetic information by the government. And this is primarily what they're talking about. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I look forward to further conversation.
Oh, thank you, Ellen. Thank you for that really great overview of the policy and ethical considerations here. I was really glad that you also talked a little bit about the limitations and who should be setting limitations on investigative genetic genealogy, to use the term that Cece has said. So maybe I actually just start there. As you mentioned, the public is pretty split on what those restrictions and what those limitations should be. So where do you think should there be restrictions? And if so, what should they be and why? And Ellen, I'll start with you.
Well, I think we could certainly talk about whether there has to be probable cause or some at least justification for why you're doing the search. And again, I think that what the work that Cece does in putting together family trees and identifying suspects, that would then be the foundation of going and doing a search and getting a warrant, as the Fourth Amendment requires, is a real plausible way to go. And I think that, but fishing expeditions are not ideal. So let me turn it to Cece and see what she has to say.
I think we need to make sure that everybody in the field is following the rules. Right now, it is legal for law enforcement to, for instance, upload against terms of service. They could upload to GEDmatch as a regular kit and not name it or not let GEDmatch know that it's a law enforcement kit. And they could technically compare against the whole database. I think that should not be allowed. And hopefully we're all following those rules and those terms of service, but I think that it's important to make sure that's happening across the board. I can only speak for my team. We always try to follow best practices and follow all the rules. I'm not necessarily sure that that's happening across the board. So that would be one thing that I would be in favor of limiting. I'm very comfortable doing this work for violent crimes as well. That, you know, people can debate that, but I think that is the most justifiable use for it, as well as identifying these Jane and John Does.
And as you're saying, a lot of this depends on best practices within the community, the terms of services of these companies. So, you know, those things can, terms of services at least, can change anytime. We've seen them change several times in fact, like in the case of GEDmatch, as you were talking about earlier. So if this all kind of just relies on people, you know, doing as they say, how do we make sure that these restrictions actually happen?
Are you asking me first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult thing. And one of the problematic things about this field is that the two databases are held in private for-profit company hands at the moment. And they could change their minds at any time, as you mentioned, just like GEDmatch did back in 2019 when they opted their entire database out of law enforcement matching and instituted the requirement to actively opt in. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I do think that that's problematic. So I really think it would be beneficial if there was a database in nonprofit hands or in government hands. And I actually started advocating back in 2014 for the government to start building their own SNP-based database for forensic use. And Ellen, I'm fine with the use of forensic. I just don't want it confused with what we're doing. And so forensics is perfectly fine, just not for genetic genealogy, in my opinion. And so I think
since Ellen raised the idea of a universal DNA database, what do you think of that?
That's extreme. I'm not sure. I'll leave that discussion to people like Ellen. I mean, it would obviously make my job not necessary, which is fine because I'm happy working with adoptees and others. But that's obviously the extreme compared to what we're doing now. So if people have a problem with the work we're doing using these profiles, I would think they would have even more of a problem with the universal genetic database. But again, I'm not an expert on that. I'll leave that to Ellen, who is.
Well, the truth is, I mean, the likelihood that that could pass in this country at this moment is non-existent. I mean, given what's going on in this country. But I think that at least part of our purpose in doing this was to say that we need to figure out how to get rid of the bias and how to get that was a cleaner solution to what we wanted, to what one wanted to do about these direct-to-consumer databases than what we were seeing now. I think that what we're seeing with GEDmatch and with Family Tree DNA is that they're responding to what people are telling them, which is that we want a choice. Now, I know from long experience that opt-out is very uncommon. Opt-in is harder. And so I think one of the things we would want to see going forward is whether is a more robust process where people could actually make a choice about whether whether data about them were included in these databases and were accessed by law enforcement. So that's always a possibility. I always think of these things and what's the possibility for the individual to control? What's the governance mechanism? What should these banks be doing? I am confident that one of the reasons that both GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA are more cautious than they were was they figured it out that doing what they were doing wasn't going to work, and that it was going to make people unhappy. So I think that kind of oversight, and then looking at how we think about downstream uses and what are appropriate and what are not. And I think your point, CC, about not uploading fake, fake records is a really important one, because again, we want a notion of transparency at least, and that as a general rule, and that violates that. So I think that those things are all part of the solution to this. I think a universal database is a non-starter in this country at this point, but it sure allowed us to make some points about, if the legislators had a skin in the game, if they were at stake, or if their family was at stake, maybe they'd pay more attention to protections. That was really part of where we were going.
Well, one of the good things about using these genetic genealogy databases is that reverse bias, as I call it. We are leveling the playing field to a certain degree, because we are able to identify people that have stayed under the radar for years and decades using the law enforcement databases. People, as I said, with primarily Northwest European ancestry with deep roots in the United States. So it is making a lot of people identifiable through these databases that were not identifiable through the law enforcement databases. And so in that way, it does level the playing field a bit.
Yeah, I think that's both of these are really good issues to keep in mind for journalists, that both of these databases are biased, but they're biased in very different ways. I wanted to think a little bit back to the case that kind of kicked off this whole conversation, which is of course the Golden State Killer case. And we're a little bit over 2 years out since the news first broke, and I was hoping to ask both of you, as you watched the journalism coverage, what did you think of it? Because in some ways, this is like perfect catnip media story, right? This is infamous serial killer case solved using innovative technique. Every journalist was trying to jump on this story. I'm sure CC got a lot of calls during that time. What did you think of the journalism about that case? And were there good or bad examples that you would point to? CC, why don't we start with you this time?
Sure. Because I was the genetic genealogist that was most known for educating the public about this, I did receive nonstop calls and requests. I had already spoken to a lot of the journalists in the past about this field, as I think Sarah knows. And so they knew to contact me, even though I wasn't directly involved in that case. What I spent my time trying to do was dispel these misconceptions, the same things that I've talked about today in my PowerPoint, that we used Ancestry DNA, or that they used Ancestry DNA or 23andMe, that law enforcement had access to all those databases. Also, that it's based on one match. Even in that case, although there was one match that they started with, there were multiple matches that they ended up working with. This shouldn't be on one person's shoulders that a family member gets identified. In most, if not all of the cases I've worked, even without one person, we still would have identified the contributor of that DNA based on these other matches. We're using second, third, fourth cousins and beyond. And even if we get that closer match, we're still using those other matches as supporting information. And so I just spent a lot of time educating. Some people got it right, some people didn't. I spent hours on the phone with many journalists from that day on, trying to make sure that the coverage was as accurate as possible and as transparent as possible, as Ellen said. I think transparency is incredibly important. I wanted the public to know how this is done so they can make an informed choice rather than from misconceptions. I want them to understand how we're doing this, and they can then decide whether it's something they feel comfortable with or not, but they should do that from an educated standpoint.
Ellen, what about you? What did you think about the journalism that came out of that particular case since then?
I thought it was actually quite good. And the thing I thought about this case was that this is a case that pretty much everybody was happy that he was caught. And so I'm thinking about a case from 2 decades ago from Sweden where the prime minister was killed in a shopping mall, and they identified the perpetrator using a newborn blood spot. Now they had to do a lot more policing to get to that and to make the, identify the person for sure. But when there's something really bad that happens, people are pretty happy, I think, when they're found. And the other thing that is such an important issue, as Cece has said, is that it's never just the DNA. There's a ton of policing that has to happen, and all of that has to go on. And so I think overall it went pretty well.
I have to say, it's what helped me make the decision to work with law enforcement, because I'd been receiving inquiries for years asking if I thought my techniques could help solve some of these types of cases. And I had hesitated for a number of reasons that it's too much to go into right now. But the coverage on that really convinced me that, okay, everyone is seeing this very positively. Even some of the bioethicists that I really respect and look up to were writing very positive things. And I thought, okay, well, what have I been waiting for? You know, everyone seems to think this is a really good thing. And so it was incredibly positive. I think much more so than I ever imagined it would be, because I was waiting for that day to come on pins and needles when this finally would happen, and see how the public and my own community would react.
Mm-hmm. And so since then, it's sort of genetic genealogy has been used in, I think Cece, you mentioned it's over almost 200 cases in your presentation.
That's just my team, so it's probably 300 approximately now.
Okay, yeah. So we've gone from this like very extraordinary first case where it's used to, I don't want to say it's routine. It's not routine yet, but it's a lot more routine than it was. What are the stories that journalists should be covering now that this is kind of like, fallen from the headlines, but it's still being used every day by law enforcement? What are the stories that journalists should be following and the issues they should be thinking about?
Who would you like to go first?
I'll tell you what I think that journalists need to be paying attention to are these new laws that are being proposed in various states. The new law in Maryland, the new law in Montana, what's being considered in California. I mean, these are really big laws, and and I don't know if you've noticed it, but there are a number of other states that have issued genetic privacy laws in various ways in the last year. Colorado, Virginia, Florida may do this. And so I think, and some of them are not so much having to do directly with law enforcement. Others of them explicitly are doing so. And I think you really need to look and see what the states are doing and why they're doing it, what's driving it. I think that is, that's going to be enormously important going forward. So that I'm a law professor, so so I would be interested in that. But I find this really intriguing. So what about you, Cece?
Yeah, I agree with that, because there's a lot of questions about the interpretation of those laws. I was involved with the Maryland committee that worked on that law, and I think a lot of what they put into it ended up being very beneficial. But it's difficult to understand, and in the practice of it, to know exactly how to interpret it and what our part is in it. Fortunately, most of the burden was put on law enforcement in that law, as it should be. But it is a little confusing for the genetic genealogists that are working in Maryland, and I haven't been working in Montana, but I'm sure will be, to know what we're supposed to be doing, what we're not supposed to be doing. So it'd be good to see some really in-depth analysis of those laws and the interpretations of what they actually mean in practice for us. Another thing I think journalists should be looking at is what I'm calling the maturation of investigative genetic genealogy. And Sarah wrote an amazing article about how the early cases were really focused on these very high profile cases that often were white victims, in line with the missing white woman syndrome we've heard so much about recently with the Gabby Petito case. It was following along those lines, a lot of white female victims, a lot of blonde women and children. And it's really changing. And I'm so happy to see that. We're really getting a much more diverse type of cases where the victim is from perhaps riskier lifestyle or lower income or minority background. And I think that's something that should be covered. As we're seeing less attention on genetic genealogy, I would like to see attention on some of those cases where we're able to use this technique to benefit different groups of people, different socioeconomic status. And we're seeing a lot more cases where, for instance, sex workers have been murdered or raped. And I think those are important stories to tell as well. So I'm a little sad to see that less coverage is happening now, that we're actually working with some of these cases that did not get much attention at all. I always try to read the articles about the cases when I start to work on one. And a lot of the ones I'm working on now, there's almost no media coverage at all, because it was this group of people that wasn't getting the type of coverage that we were seeing for the ones that were traditionally high profile cases. So I would encourage journalists to seek out some of those stories and tell those as well.
Ellen, it sounds like maybe you had something to add to this, or maybe you were just agreeing.
Oh, I'm mostly just agreeing. I was thinking another thing that's slightly tangential to this is that I think there's growing attention being paid to how family finding, what the impact it is on people, because that's also quite mixed. We've done, some people really like it, some people really don't. One of my colleagues looked at analyses from comments on Reddit, and by far the biggest emotion was about either finding family members that you didn't know you had, or finding that some of the people that were family members that you thought you were related to that you weren't. I think that this genealogy is an American passion. Maybe it's an international passion, but I know for sure it's an American passion. And but doing it in this way has been a game changer. And the social consequences are going to be really interesting to follow as it all plays out. So that's something that I'm also interested in. There have been a lot of stories in the New York Times and other places, but so that's another thing, that this kind of work, as you look for adoption or sperm donors or others like that, Cece, I'm sure that the responses are sometimes complex.
Yes, and this is something that I've been working with for over a decade now. And I was encouraging journalists to write about these stories way back, waiting for there to be attention put on this. And we really operated under the radar for many years. And as I mentioned, Pandora came out of the box some time ago, long before the Golden State Killer case. We have been able to help people learn, millions of people now learn about their genetic heritage in a way they weren't expecting. I have a group on Facebook, DNA detectives, but right now we have 160,000 members, people that have either taken tests and learned unexpected surprises or are trying to solve family mysteries. And we've probably had another couple 100,000 pass through in the last 6 years or so that have resolved their mysteries. And there's been very little attention on that. And, it is also complex, as Ellen said. There's a lot to study there. And I think that there's been a bit of a lag in doing that. This has been a really important development well before the Golden State Killer case, and there just wasn't much attention. I was, as I said, trying to get those stories out there, but it's really rich for study, and there's so many different aspects of it that really should be studied by academics, by it.
Why do you think that had been under the radar for so long? Because as you were saying, these techniques that you developed that you now use for with law enforcement, they were all developed to help people look for their families. Why? And there are lots of people. Why was it under the radar?
I think people just saw it as this hobby thing, genealogy. It was created by citizen scientists, not by academics and traditional scientists. And so it wasn't something that most people were that interested in, unless you were interested in genealogy or you had one of these significant family mysteries. I think it just wasn't getting that much attention from people that weren't directly affected by it. But now we've seen, as Ellen said, probably 40 million people have participated in direct consumer testing. And many of those people, I would say the majority of those people, have a story of their own now, how it's changed their perception of their biological family or heritage, or they know somebody that was significantly impacted. And so it's mostly, I think, because so many people have now participated, and this has become so much more common for people to experience it. You know, when you experience something personally or someone you love does, that really brings it home to a much greater degree than just hearing it from someone else.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the fact that genetic genealogy kind of started up as citizen science, and there aren't necessarily academic papers that are published about it. You don't get a degree in it, and so I'm wondering for journalists then, like, how do journalists then find and vet sources who understand what they're really talking about? There aren't really official accreditations, and if you're looking for people who can comment on the larger social implications, how do you find these experts? And Ellen, why don't you start with your thoughts on this?
Well, I'll let Cece talk about the technical part. I can tell you that there's a lot of interest now in looking at the impact of direct-to-consumer genetic testing. As you can see by the fact that I cited a whole bunch of articles in the middle in my talk. And so I think that and there's actually a growing popular literature, the book Inheritance, the book The Lost Family, Random Families so there is a growing amount of literature out there looking at what that's meant for families. And as I said, this is such an important phenomenon, and 40 million people is well over 10% of the US population. I mean, this is a big proportion of the population here, and the impact can be dramatic. So there is some, I followed this literature, there is some literature, there's going to be more because it's such an important force. Academic literature, there's a ton of lots of popular literature, which yes. I'm gathering and going to write a paper about. So
yeah, ever since the Golden State Killer suspect was arrested, it really has changed the focus. And that has included looking more at the implications on families as well. And I think, like 23andMe has recently gone public, and I've seen a lot more articles about medical findings and unknown family member findings in the news as a result as well. And I think there's some connection there. I'm constantly Google alerts on 23andMe stories of people finding this type of information, positive stories. So I think there's been a much bigger push to get those stories out there. I will say MyHeritage DNA, that company has always really seen the power of these stories and has worked really hard and put a lot of marketing money behind getting those stories out. But that hadn't happened really in previous years. I was, as I said, constantly trying to pitch these stories to journalists and get these stories told. And for instance, one of those did eventually end up becoming that book, The Lost Family. That was a story that I had told her, the author, about many years before, and eventually grew to that. And so those stories were just waiting to be told. There are hundreds of thousands of those stories out there that are very compelling. As far as to your question about finding who to talk to, fortunately, there's a lot more educational materials out there now. There was nothing when I started. We had to create those from scratch. There still is no degree or certification or licensing for genetic genealogy, which is problematic, but I'm sure that's going to be fixed in time. The Maryland law is requiring that investigative genetic genealogists are licensed. I'm not sure if it's by 2023 or 2024. So that's going to force the hand there. I am concerned about who is going to be making those decisions and running those programs, because there are so few people that are really educated about this technique in this field. It's still a very limited number. So it is difficult not only for journalists to know who to talk to, but also for law enforcement to know who to hire, who to trust with these cases. And it worries me. It's definitely a big concern of mine. I think to get education, you have to really be proactive and you have to seek it out, but it is out there now. There are so many webinars about genetic genealogy that can be accessed online. Just my Institute for Genetic Genealogy alone has a lot of videos on genetic genealogy. We have been doing annual conferences for several years now, and we have that online, but there's also many, many others out there, but you have to be proactive. And many journalists have spent hours on the phone with me over the last several years, even over the last decade, trying to learn about this. And so you really do have to invest the time, because if it's something you just cover very briefly, that's where we really see those misconceptions and those mistakes being presented to the public, and that can be very damaging, in my opinion.
So
Yeah, I think, go ahead.
I want to answer one of the questions that's in the Q&A, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So they were talking about pharma-funded research that collect genetic samples, and can you get to genetic data, pharma genetic databases? So I want to say something about genetics research in general. In general, you really don't keep the person's name with it. In general, what you do is you get the data, you de-identify it to some extent. I mean, at least take the name off and put a code on or something like that. So the data that are in research databases mostly don't say Ellen Clayton, Vanderbilt University Medical Center professor. They mostly don't say that. They would say, if anything, a woman of Northern European ancestry who lives in Nashville, Tennessee. Who lives in Tennessee, not even Nashville, Tennessee. So one of the things that we think about in terms of where you're going to go to get data to do a re-identification, a research database is not your first place you want to go. That's why GEDmatch and please correct me if I'm wrong, Cece, but that's why GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA are so valuable, because people put their names on them. They may not put everything else, but they put a lot more than what's on in pharma. So, and then if you're going to go to pharma to look for a match or something like that, not only are you going to have to re-identify the person, but you also have to have some reason to think they're in there. So I know we worry about going, I spend a lot of time thinking about protecting genomic research data, believe me, but they're not your primary place you go if you want to find some way to identify somebody. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think that's a CC misconception. It is data in research databases typically are not identified with names and all that sort of stuff. So sorry.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like I mentioned, it's useless to me if I do not know who you are and can't build your family tree, because I'm usually working with those distant cousins. I need to know who your great grandparents are. And so if I don't even know who you are, then I can't use that data. And as in GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, there are names, sometimes they're initials, sometimes they're usernames. I can usually figure out who that DNA contributor is from that. And if I can't use that match. And so that's a really good point that Ellen makes. I'm glad she did, because I do get asked that question, and now I know how to answer it. Thank you. I hadn't thought of that. They're identified, so of course, yeah, not useful to us at all.
Yeah, I think that really underscores the point how it's not really DNA, or DNA is a small part of the work that has to be done to actually find these matches. It's a lot of, as Cece was saying, public record searches, very laborious ones. Examples that I've known about sometimes, and a lot of information that we might not realize we've been putting out there on social media, on white pages. There's a lot of stuff. As a journalist, I can also say there's a lot of stuff about all of us out there. It's very easy to find it with Google.
Yeah,
we have one other.
Well, no, I just wanted to comment on that briefly. You know, as you journalists well know, you can find a lot of information about people. And if people have not done a lookup on themselves, they might be shocked. And I think when we talk about choosing for your family, when you put your genetic information on GEDmatch, for instance, that we're doing the same thing when we post on Facebook or social media about our families. But not just that, if you order flowers for your friend and you give their address and their name, that very likely is going to end up in one of those people search databases that then is sold to consumers. Things end up in credit reports. And I think that our society, if we're really concerned about privacy, we need to be considering those things as well. People, these companies, these for-profit companies collect information on us and sell it. And that is really a huge privacy issue from my perspective, because that's where I'm getting all my information. When I'm working a case in Canada, it's extremely difficult to put family trees together, to find who relatives are, because they have laws that protect their citizens from things like that. And so I think that's an important thing to think about when we're having this discussion.
That's really interesting that it's so different even between Canada and the US. I imagine Europe is probably also a lot more difficult too.
Oh, much more difficult.
So we have a question in the Q&A, and I think, Ellen, you took a crack at answering it, but I'd also like CC to weigh in. So the question from John Light is, how confident are you the jury members understood the genetic genealogy information that was presented in court? Did they receive training prior to the trial? Ellen, you said, hard to know how much they understand. The lawyers are supposed to do the teaching. CC, what is it from your perspective?
Actually, the point is that it was not presented in the trial. That was the decisions made by either the judges or stipulations between the defense and the prosecution, that the genetic genealogy research was not relevant. What was relevant was the investigation they did after that, and whether did they get that STR CODIS profile match. And so far in these trials, genetic genealogy has been discussed very little. In fact, usually just summarized by the detective. I've been on hold as an expert witness for many, many trials. I've been canceled every single time because they have all decided it's not relevant. It's not exculpatory evidence for the defense. It's not something that's going to be used against this suspect, in this defendant in trial. So I have testified for some pretrial hearings for the judge to help the judge understand it, and also in some grand jury trials. But it's been very brief, and it really hasn't been relevant to these cases. And that is what we're seeing. That's what we hoped would happen. Now, that's not to say that some judge will rule completely differently later, but so far that is how it's been handled in court. And so the jurors probably didn't understand it, and they weren't required to make their decisions.
Mm-hmm. So I have one more question before I turn it to both of you for closing remarks, but this is relevant to privacy, not just in the context of law enforcement, but in context of all these family discoveries that we've been talking about too, which is that we normally think of privacy as like my personal privacy, but as we've been saying, when you talk about uploading someone's DNA, it affects not just me, but my entire family. So how should we think about privacy in the context of it impacting your entire, out to your third cousins even, and not just you? How do we think about privacy in that context? And CC, do you want to take a crack at that first?
Well, I actually briefly addressed this already in my comments about what we put out there about our families in other aspects, in social media in particular. It's hugely valuable for me that people are tagging their family members, posting pictures, they're writing back and forth in the comments, hey cousin, hey aunt, hey sis. There is a spot on Facebook where you can actually list your relationships, and many people do. And so we are making those types of choices for our families and our loved ones all the time when we're putting information out there. And as I said, including with these people search type databases, they are telling us, if you pay for those services, they will tell you who is living in the same households, who is buying homes and property together and registering cars. And it'll list all of the associates and family members on those lists. And so that's what I'm spending my day digging in. is those types of resources in order to figure out who's related to who's associated with who. On GEDmatch, many times we'll see people who handle other people's kids. So for instance, I manage, say, 50 kits on GEDmatch. Well, it's going to have my email address, but I'm not the DNA contributor. So if I find one of those kits that is one of the key matches in one of my cases, I have to figure out how this owner of this email address is associated with this other person, this initials oftentimes. Figure out who are they related to or who are they friends with these initials. And so how do I do that? I'm going to look at people search databases. I'm going to look at Facebook. And most of the time I can figure out who it is through that. And so I think the conversation is much larger than just, you know, if you upload your DNA to GEDmatch, you're exposing your family. There's a lot more that goes into it.
I couldn't agree more. I think that we implicate our families in things all the time. And I wonder about people who post pictures of their young babies. I'm old enough that my kids were grown by the time this all happened. And so I think that we live in a much more connected world than I think we know, and that our actions affect many more people than we know. And I think and whether you think that requires more thoughtfulness or whether you think that this is all fine is actually sort of an open question that people can think about. But I completely agree with Cece. I don't spend time doing what she does, but I do know that all those data are out there, and it's really kind of spooky sometimes.
Yeah, there's a lot out there on all of us. Well, if there are any more questions, I'm going to ask both of you to just kind of maybe spend a couple of minutes summing up, giving some concluding remarks. So Ellen, why don't we start with you this time?
Sure. I think the big question is still open, which is how much we want law enforcement to have access to these data. But there's a secondary question, which is we need to do a better job, or how do we do a better job of telling people what actually is possible and what is not possible, so that they are not surprised when these data are used in this way, and which is, I think, an enormously important issue here. So I think our expectations of privacy are probably greater than are realistic much of the time. And I think we have to weigh the social good of allowing people to connect in the way they want to connect, and living in a society that in fact is going to try to punish serious crime. I mean, that's the trade-off, and we have to figure that out.
I fully agree. And I think education is just paramount here. People really do need to understand the process, as I said, before they can make an informed choice, whether this is something they support, want to contribute their genetic profile to or not. And if lawmakers, judges, attorneys don't understand this, I believe we're going to run into problems. And that was one reason I was really happy to be invited to present to the committee that wrote the Maryland law, because I think it's just so important. And I think it's often surprising to people that are not doing the actual work like I am, what we really are doing and what we really aren't doing, and what information is being accessed and what isn't being accessed. And so the more education that we can have, the better. And that's why you all journalists, the media, are so important. I did a TV series for ABC about my work, which I really didn't want to do, believe it or not. They had a hard time convincing me, but ultimately I decided to do it, but with the agreement that we would be very transparent and educational about the process. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been worth it for me. I wanted the public to get a real view of how I do my work and how we work with law enforcement and how that information is used, how I come to those conclusions or those hypotheses. And so I am, very appreciative of the media, of you journalists, of educators, of academics, of researchers, everyone that's trying to get a deeper look into genetic genealogy as a whole, and specifically investigative genetic genealogy, to help educate the public and help people get a much broader understanding of this. And so we can make informed choices as individuals, but also as a community and as a society.
Well, I do hope this panel has been really educational for everyone who's attended. Thank you to Susie and Ellen for sharing your expertise. Thank you to the Hastings Center for hosting us today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all for joining us today. A recording of the discussion will be available shortly on the Hastings Center's website, www.thehastingscenter.org, and on LC Hub, along with resources. We would like your feedback on this event. You will receive a brief survey via email shortly after this event. Please return it as soon as possible. We will use your feedback to improve future events. Please join us on November 16th for the next discussion in this series, Precision Medicine Research, All of Us and Inclusion, with Nidhi Subbaraman, a writer for Nature, Sandra Sujin Lee, Chief of the Division of Ethics in the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics at Columbia University and PI of the SARA, Carolyn Newhouse, a research scholar at the Hastings Center, and Catherine Blazinski, the Policy Director for the All of Us Research Program. Thank you again and have a great day.